Home on the Hill and the Pirooz Center for Mental Health Wellness are very pleased to have Dr. Sethna, Psychiatrist-in-Chief at Markham Stouffville Hospital, come and present on the topic of bipolar disorder. Our organizations hear from families who struggle to support individuals with this profound disorder, and we would like to have more psychiatrists and more science-informed services to help. I would like now to introduce our member, Home on the Hill member, who will describe her experience of having bipolar disorder. She has asked that her identity be kept private.
I'm 56 and wasn't formally diagnosed as bipolar until 3 years ago. I've battled mental illness since I was a teenager. Much of what I went through over the decades, I have only recently begun to understand as part of my illness. I always believed that I suffered only from depression. I would show up at my doctor's office when I was so low you couldn't scrape me off the ground or get me out of bed on many a day. All I could do was cry. I was prescribed antidepressants. They never helped. I got all of the nasty side effects, but none of the benefits. I came to believe that I was one of those treatment-resistant individuals who would suffer lifelong mental illness. When not depressed, I bubbled with energy, was very restless, and didn't need much sleep. My thoughts raced so much that my words would tumble out too fast, at times incomprehensibly, and others kept asking me to calm down. Calm down? Why? I was full of energy, and they couldn't keep up, and were dull people. During these periods, I never went to my doctor as I was up rather than down. So my doctor was never able to diagnose me properly, even though she would ask what I experienced when I wasn't depressed. To me, this wasn't hyperactivity or mania. This was much better than depression, and I didn't want or need help in my mind. I later discovered that I didn't have the severe type of bipolar. I didn't experience psychosis with my milder form of mania. My disorder did, however, lead to difficulty holding down a job for any length of time. I job hopped. I was too restless and unable to focus long enough to sit still and do a good enough job in my mind, so I quit, until the next interesting opportunity came along. I also went back to school to get another degree at age 40, and I changed my career. However, by age 50, my disorder was catching up with me, and I struggled to continue working at all. By age 54, I went on a disability leave and am still on a leave, going on my 3rd year now. My doctor, a GP, referred me to a psychiatrist who diagnosed me 3 years ago as bipolar. I'm now on an antipsychotic medication, but it isn't really working well. Not well enough to get me back to work. The lesson here is to get an early diagnosis and treatment to have a better chance of recovery. We have to get past the stigma and share information. Education about this and other serious mental disorders is crucial.
It's my honor tonight to introduce our guest speaker, who is definitely not a stranger to most of us, as we have heard him speak before, and anyone who is involved with Markham Stouffville Hospital and any of their psychiatric facilities will know exactly who Dr. Sethna is. Dr. Rustom Sethna is the Chief of Psychiatry at Markham Stouffville Hospital, where services are provided to individuals suffering from severe persistent major mental illnesses across their lifespan. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and has appointments at Queen's and McMaster Universities and the University of Toronto, where he is an assistant professor and lecturer respectively. He has subspecialty interests in neuropsychiatry and geriatric psychiatry. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Rustom Sethna to the microphone and welcome you all again here this evening, and I hope you have a very, very informative time. Thank you all very much.
I've worked in this field for coming in on 30 years now, and the most compelling thing about the work we do is the fact that we can provide such phenomenal service to people with organizations such as yours. And I'm so grateful that organizations like yours exist, and I hope they will obviously gain momentum over time and do greater and greater things for the people who suffer from major mental disorder. The functioning of a healthy brain requires reliance on something called a neural network, a network of things called neurons. And these neurons make connections and pathways, and all of this, these connections and pathways end up with an entity that's a single entity, which is our brain. These are some pictures of the brain that are quite phenomenal, actually, and they come from a project called the Human Connectome Project. It's an international effort to use something called fMRI. Now, fMRI is something called functional MRI. You guys know what MRI is. It's a kind of a sophisticated investigation of your organ system using a magnet. So this project, called the Human Connectome Project, is trying to map the entire brain, trying to map connections between neurons in the brain, and one day, I think it will predict traits and offer insights into the effects of treatment on the brain. Now, these are just like wires, and this is a brain in action, okay? So the brain was tasked with something, and it started to fire. And as it fired, different things light up on an fMRI differently. And so you get this fascinatingly beautiful thing, This is a new pathway in research, and I thought I'd share it with you because it's exciting and it's going to help us in the end figure stuff out with our brain. And so I'm going to focus today on bipolarity or bipolar disorder. And this is a chronic illness, and it's marked by alternating periods of mood from highs to lows. So the key feature being that when these mood changes occur, individuals have a functional impairment. And that limits them and disallows them from being adaptive with their life. The long-term course of this disease is that it is obviously, because of its chronicity, a lifetime disease. The predominance, however, of mood change in bipolar disorder is not mania or hypomania, but depression. And in order to make the diagnosis, you need to have manic or hypomanic episodes, at least one of them in your lifetime, but that's all you really need. So the treatments must be long-term treatments. Short-term treatments are usually just your acute crisis, but the long-term is where people stay well, and that's really the focus of the work that we do. And that involves, unfortunately with this illness, because it is a biological disease, it involves taking medicines, and it involves talk therapies of different types. So you get talk therapies that are individual talk therapies, and you get talk therapies that are group talk therapies, and you get support environments such as this, which are also kinds of talk therapies. And of course, you need careful long-term monitoring from someone that knows about these conditions. So essentially, the manic type 1, so in mania, there are two types of high-end mood. There is the bipolar type 1, who is frankly manic, and then there's the bipolar type 2, who is hypomanic, which is a lower grade of mania. Essentially, people with the manic side or the high side of mood, where the roof on their mood has opened up like skylight, and it's opened up, and they've shot through the roof, are distractible, they're indiscreet, they're impulsive, they're reckless, they're elated, they're energized, or they can be highly irritable. The criteria requires that you have at least 1 week of this rush of emotionality to make a diagnosis. Hypomanias, like I explained to you, the type 2 are the milder version of this, so everything's kind of toned down a bit in volume. And then obviously in bipolar disorder, we get depressions. It's a tough diagnosis. And interestingly, 25% of people that are depressed and are just not getting better are usually individuals with bipolar disease. 69% of people in a survey reported that they were misdiagnosed before they were diagnosed with bipolar disease. Usually unipolar depression was the diagnosis. And 35% of people had symptoms for more than 10 years before they were diagnosed, which is a very long time. Unfortunately, women are more likely to be misdiagnosed than men. But these are really problematic things for us, because you can imagine 10 years of suffering before you're diagnosed. That's awful. No matter how hard we work and no matter how much effort we put into caring for people, we will lose people sometimes to suicide, which is one of the most painful parts of my work, and I know for anyone who works in this field's work. About 50% of people with this condition, no matter how well you're treated and how well the diagnosis was made and all that stuff, about half the group have made at least one suicide attempt or will make one in their lifetime. And that is scary, but you know, it is very common. And we need to be aware of it, and we need to keep a watchful eye on people we love, because there is a risk that they would try to hurt themselves. So they would attempt. That doesn't mean they complete suicide. They attempt suicide. Sometimes it's a cry for help because they're feeling desperate. It's their only way into a system. So, but for whatever their reason might be, half the population with bipolar disease will have attempted at least once in their lifetime. We know that bipolar disease is influenced by genes, and we know that this is something we've learned from twin studies and family studies. And we also know that stresses and triggers are the commonest cause of the expression of this disease. So typically, you may have a diathesis or a predisposition towards bipolarity, but typically your first episodes or your severe episodes will always have a trigger or a stress that drives you into that polar swing. Treatment is complicated in this condition. The best treatment is the long-term treatment. It's an individualized format of treatment. It allows for tailor-making a patient's care to the individual needs of that person rather than a generic model of care. And that might, as I mentioned earlier, might mean, you know, intensive housing emphasis for someone versus intensive group therapy for someone else versus, you know, getting someone back into school as part of their treatment, and that becomes a huge thrust. So it's different for each person, but the most important thing is that the fundamentals of your treatment must ensure that the diagnosis is right, that people are safe, and when I say people are safe, I mean individuals who suffer from the disease, but also people around them. The focus of treatment is an alliance with the individual suffering from the disorder, an alliance with their family, educating people on an ongoing basis, encouraging people to come out to evenings like this where we can talk about the condition, destigmatizing these illnesses, which I know is a huge focus for you here and is a very important focus for us in general as people. Obviously, staying in treatment and maintaining compliance is very important, and managing challenges, which is what life's all about. There are many medicines to treat this condition. The modalities of treatment, we usually start with one medicine. That's usually the plan. The plan usually never works out. But I must say, there are times where, you know, I've been successful in terms of having someone stay stable on one medicine. But it's the exception rather than the rule. Combination treatments are the most effective, and they're kind of the rule. ECT or shock treatments, sometimes useful for extreme poles of the disease, but it doesn't really help us a lot in the long term, because ECT or shock treatments to the brain end up with other kinds of side effects like cognitive dulling, and in the long term may not be the best strategy for maintenance of an individual with an illness. So they are short-term strategies that we don't really rely on, at least not at Markham Stouffville that much. Psychosocial therapies are really important. These are therapies that involve your community-based supports. So workers from organizations like CMHA, social work staff at the hospital, day hospital programming, housing programming, all of that. The psychosocial model allows for higher recovery rates at the 1 year mark, and also allows for shorter time to recovery for people that are suffering from severe illness. Of all the magical treatments in psychiatry, lithium is phenomenal. This drug saves lives. Of all the drugs in psychiatry, as it relates to bipolar disease, this drug needs to be your number one drug. It should be part of the plan. It's a safe, effective, cheap drug. It's easy to tolerate. It's now available in a more sustained release preparation, so it's gentle on the system. It has some effects that we monitor for on things like your kidneys or your thyroid, but we monitor very tightly for these things when we have someone on lithium, and we usually modify dosing based on something called a lithium level, where we draw a blood test, and we try to ensure that the level stays within a reasonable range for a human. Usually people stay well for years on lithium, those that will decide that this is the drug they want to take. So long-term treatment prevents disability, and preventing disability is what we're all about in this field. We don't want people to suffer endlessly with bipolar disease. We obviously have to ensure that relapse doesn't happen after a first episode. So first episodes are typically the worst episodes in these conditions. So when an individual with bipolar disease presents for the first time, they're usually in their worst episode. Typically after that, once we get to know people and we get to know their diseases and we get to know their symptom load, we can typically modify the course of their illness and attenuate the intensity of their swinging, so that they don't swing with the same intensity or experience the same amount of despair or dysfunction. Not always the case, but that's the hope anyway. And it's really important that people who are stable, who get from there to there, remain on maintenance treatment, because relapse is very high in this disorder. It is biology. It is not willpower. You will flip if you stop your medications. It is a guarantee, money back. You are not going to stay stable if you stop your drugs. The average age of onset with this condition is 22. Recurrence is a guarantee. It will happen. It's almost certain that it's going to happen. As age advances, episodes may become more frequent, and there may be some low-grade rumbling residual symptoms. Again, I don't want to paint a picture of doom and gloom here, because the net end result for most patients in our care is very, very good. People get better and stay well, and we are able to capture symptoms really quickly when they show up and tell us there's something wrong. And people generally have much, much better lives today than they did even 10 years ago with these disorders. Manic episodes typically have a sudden onset, so you don't get a lot of warning with mania. But depressions are more insidious, so they creep up on you. So depressive symptoms tend to kind of build and build and build over weeks, whereas manic symptoms, maybe a day or 2 days, and you're starting to flip into hypomania. When we talk about bipolar disease, we talk about two poles. We talk about mania and we talk about depression. These are the two poles of bipolar. So when you have, let's say you have a manic episode, and we have you in hospital because you're really, really sick, and we have to manage you and get you better, and we do, and we get you better, and we return you back to life. In the immediate period, so a week or two after your discharge from hospital, if you were to not comply with treatment, or if your management wasn't sound and we hadn't done a good enough job and you were going to relapse, people who relapse within the first couple of weeks of an episode will usually relapse back to the same pole. They don't go from manic to depressed. So manic people who were manic and were discharged in a few weeks will go bang back to that pole, almost magnetically. And the same is true of depression. You will go back to the pole that you were at again, bang. However, in the longer term, people that were manic and got better and stayed well, their next episode will likely be the opposite pole. So they will go down. 85% of them will go the other way. And so that's why you have this massive swinging of mood from the bottom end to the top end. So, you know, this condition is a really serious condition. And it's complicated to diagnose, complicated to manage, complicated to understand. But the most important thing that I have to emphasize is the connection to community treatment teams. You know, whatever that treatment team might be, whoever that person might be, staying connected in the long term changes the prognosis completely for you. The future is exciting for this disease, but there's a lot to learn and a lot to uncover. In all likelihood, we probably know more about the universe beyond our Earth than we do about the one between our ears. So thank you for listening.